Dear colleagues and friends, my name is Miha Marčenko. I'm a Max Weber Fellow here at the EY Institute, and I'm honored to introduce this month's Max Weber interview with Professor Jack Snyder. With me, I have Zselyke Csaky, a policy leader fellow here at the EY, and together we will conduct this interview with Professor Snyder. So first, a brief introduction of our distinguished interviewee. Jack Snyder is a Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. This is also where he defended his PhD. Snyder's interests include international relations theory, post-Soviet politics, nationalism, human rights, and liberalism. Professor Snyder is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the editor of W.W. Norton book series on world politics. He's an author of several books, which include Electing to Fight, Why Emerging Democracies Go to War, with Edward D. Mansfield, From Voting to Violence, Democratization and Nationalist Conflict, and Myths of Empire, Domestic Politics and International Ambition. He's the editor of several books, including Human Rights Futures with Stephen Hopgood and Leslie Vinjamuri, and Ranking the World, Grading States as Tools of Global Governance with Alexander Cooley. Today, we are basing our interview on his most recent book, titled Human Rights for Pragmatists, Social Power in Modern Times, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2022. So I would like to warmly welcome our interviewee and give the mic to Zselyke to start with the questions.
Thank you, Miha, and thank you, Professor Snyder, for being here. So I think to kick us off, I would like to ask you about the advice that you would give to those academics who want to combine their academic interest with human rights activism. So this is a topic that has been discussed among people working on the rule of law, but also on human rights in general. And I would also just like to ask you that in general, what role do you see for academic research in activism?
Well, I come from a part of political science, international relations and studies of international security, where it's been a long tradition to combine basic research on political theory and the underlying grounding of political behavior with involvement in political activities. When I was a young person, I worked on Capitol Hill. I worked at the Rand Corporation studying Soviet military strategy, but at the same time I was, writing a book on World War I and studying how militarism and offensive military strategies caused World War I. So I saw all of those things as connecting basic theoretical social science concepts about war and conflict to contemporary policy issues. And so I see the human rights field as, potentially doing the same thing, where we try to look at history and use social theory to ask the question, well, under what kinds of social conditions are human rights possible? And what kinds of strategies do real live actors in history, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, what kind of strategies did they actually use that led to important human rights successes? And use that as a guide for activism. I see in the field of international politics a lot of interest in using that approach nowadays, not only in human rights, but including human rights, where people will do their basic social science research, have well-supported research findings, and then make them available to the attentive public, to the media, and put them out there for people to discuss. There's an online journal called Monkey Cage, where young political scientists are doing this boiling down of their social science research and commenting on free speech on the internet or nuclear deterrence or any subject. So I think activism and social science definitely can go together. However, I not long ago was talking to some colleagues at my university who I consider to be human rights scholars, who have written important things about international law and about activist strategies for social justice. And I asked them, well, why aren't you more involved with the Human Rights Institute, the human rights community at Columbia? And I was taken aback by a number of them who said, well, I think it's fine if you think I'm a human rights person, but I don't consider myself a human rights person because I see too many human rights people being dogmatic, having a single view of how to do human rights activism, naming and shaming, and they don't have an open mind about the subject. They're not intellectually exploring. They've decided what the answer is, and now they're just applying that kind of closed book knowledge in a way. So I'm just reporting what I heard from some, very creative and important scholars on that.
Thank you for this exhaustive answer. The question with which I would follow up is, how has in your long academic career your approach to research changed? So either it is with human rights, but also your other fields where you have engaged. If you could explain this a bit, are there trends? Has there been a movement?
Well, in the preface to my book on human rights for pragmatists, I made the observation that I've tended to be a contrarian in writing about democracy and human rights topics. So back in the 1990s, it was a period of self-congratulatory triumphalism for democracy, liberalism in general, and the human rights community. People saw liberalism as having no meaningful opposition and like sweeping the field, and were very ambitious about ending impunity and promoting rights in parts of the world that had lots of rights violations, but very limited institutional supports for creating a rights structure for people to use. And at the time, I was skeptical about the project. I saw it as overreaching, overambitious, not realistic about some of the limitations that faced countries that were transitioning to democracies. So I wrote about countries that had increases in media freedom, where overnight you went from like a censorship authoritarian regime to one where there were a lot of different voices holding forth in the public sphere, but where many of them were hijacked by hate speech. And you got ethnic divisions being played out in this free media. And so I was a contrarian in the sense of warning people not to be naive in expecting instant beneficial results from advancing rights such as increasing the freedom of speech, especially in societies that lacked some of the facilitating institutions to make freedom of speech function well. But the conventional wisdom now is quite the reverse. People are very pessimistic about liberalism. They think that liberalism is in crisis, not only in developing countries, but even in the core countries of the world with advanced liberal democracies that we thought were stable. And so I think that conventional wisdom has gone too far in the other direction. And so being a contrarian, in my new book on human rights for pragmatists, I try to start off by reminding people of the strengths of liberal societies based on human rights, their prosperity, their power, their track record of stability and producing results for their citizens. So I've stayed the same as being a contrarian, but as the world has swung from being triumphalist to being hyper pessimist, maybe I've stayed in the same place, and the conventional wisdom has just swung back and forth.
So then, to continue with your book specifically, it includes plenty of recommendations for human rights advocates. And one of the recommendations focuses on the localization of norms, local norms, as opposed to using universal norms or referring to universal norms and using legalese. And you also say that sometimes it's better for advocates to resort to quote-unquote technical advice. So I can easily see how that works in contexts where rights violations stem from really a lack of state capacity, where that's the main issue. But I wonder how that works in contexts where it is those local politicians who instrumentalize quote-unquote local norms for violating human rights. What should advocates do in those situations?
Yeah, I think that is a very big problem. So, and this happens in, developed liberal states as well as developing societies. Rachel Wall was a student in our program who wrote a dissertation and a fabulous book on police in India that had undergone human rights training and then went back to their police precinct and went about their business as police officers investigating crimes. And Professor Wall went around and interviewed them about their practices of how they treated people who were in their custody. And she found that they acknowledged torturing the people that they had incarcerated for investigation, and this is before they were convicted of any crime. And she asked them, well, how do you justify torturing prisoners, especially since you've had human rights training? And the story that she kept getting was, well, the human rights of our community needs to be protected, and number one is the human right to security, to not be preyed upon by these criminals. And then she would say, but they haven't been convicted of anything. Don't they deserve a fair trial? And the police would say, oh, but our court system is too slow and really doesn't deliver justice. So if we're going to punish the criminals, we really have to do it here. And it's for the human rights of the community. And so, even in our country, weaponizing human rights is a rising phenomenon. So, people think that gay or trans people are immoral. And so they refuse services to them, as customers in their businesses. And so court cases arise, and the defense is, well, I have a religious right to discriminate against gay or trans customers because my religious right trumps their right to be treated equally. And so we see this in very important ways affecting discourse in American democracy, where people, go on social media and defame other users, spread disinformation, and claim that this is their right under the First Amendment to freedom of expression. And so, yes, it's a problem that rights come into conflict, and that there's actually a strategy of weaponizing rights claims. And I think one lesson here is that we need to be careful about calling everything a human right. Some things are just policies that we want, and especially in a country like the United States that glorifies rights, there's always a temptation to call anything that you want to have happen a human right. But, this is a game that two can play.
Thank you again for this answer. Going back to your book and to the main idea that human rights can be progressed as a pragmatical project, which differs from the idealistic project that is usually espoused by the NGOs. My question would be, when does this pragmatism turn into cooptation? Where is that limit? How would you describe it or find it?
So there certainly can be a danger, especially if human rights advocates are in a very weak position, lack resources, and then get opportunities to cooperate with illiberal overlords who may, give them incentives to play along with an illiberal or corrupt system. So I do see that this is a problem. Just as, there was a problem during the Trump administration of, well, should I serve in some executive department in Trump's government on the grounds that even though I'll have to do some things that maybe are a little compromising to my principles, there has to be some responsible rights-observing person left in that government, and so I better stay, and I better stay another couple of months, and a year, and 2 years. And so there's always a fine line there. But I would make the following distinctions, that compromises of principle, where you only get half a loaf, are okay if the alternative is to get nothing. Side payments to people whose motivations are not principled in favor of human rights, but are just self-interested. But if they agree to cooperate with you on your reform, to vote for you for office, or to vote for your bill in the legislature, there's nothing wrong with that. In the book, I talk about Abraham Lincoln's appeals to northern working class people to oppose slavery being allowed in the western territories of the U.S. The line was free land for free labor. And so this was an economic appeal to the economic interests of northern workers who would want to become pioneers and get land out west. And Lincoln pointed out to them that they should be opposed to slavery's expansion into the West out of the self-interest in not wanting to compete with slave labor for working that land. So they voted for Lincoln and the anti-slavery project out of a self-interest. So I don't see that a kind of compromises or side payments as being any morally bad form of corruption, and I would distinguish it from lying, participating in cover-ups, or participating in small abuses and justifying it on the grounds of not being a worse abuse. And so my main criteria for when compromises are acceptable or not acceptable is if you can make a convincing narrative about your path towards success of a full human rights program that starts with your strategy of maybe negotiating with perpetrators of human rights abuses in the short run to move them into positions that are less dangerous as spoilers for democracy and human rights. So getting past the danger of resistance that could cripple the human rights reforms right at the beginning in order to build a stronger platform for creating human rights institutions in the subsequent steps. So you need to have a narrative of how this is going to help bend the long-term direction of history towards rights. And it needs to be, a convincing, well-supported narrative. If you have that, I think compromises, delays, side payments are, okay.
And so going back to the tools that advocates use, you mentioned before naming and shaming, and that's part of your book as well. So I would be curious to hear you expand a little bit on that and why you think it can create a backlash. And if I may add the follow-up question to that already, in which situations is the naming and shaming is the one that creates a backlash? Or is it really just part of the broader political game where power leads, as your book says? Are NGOs part of this instrumentalized game? So in other words, how do you differentiate between the different actors in this field, between the actions of the governments and the actions of the NGOs and the results from those?
So human rights advocates like to say that one of their most potent tools, their go-to methodology, is what they call naming and shaming, pointing out that something is an abuse, either morally or legally, and shaming the perpetrator of the abuse as a step towards, holding that perpetrator to account. And it occurred to me that when I talk to human rights people about shaming, really none of them had done any research on the emotion of shame and how people and groups of people typically respond to shame. So I decided to read that literature, and the result is one of the chapters in the book. People who study shame say that shaming can be constructive under certain circumstances. Sometimes a bit of light shaming may be useful for socializing youth to social expectations for proper behavior. People who are new to a group may need a little bit of light shaming if they don't quite understand the rules and need them forcefully explained to them. But usually the literature on shaming suggests avoiding that kind of direct personalized criticism because there are alternatives. So your second grade teacher generally tried not to single out people who were disruptive in class and shame them, putting a dunce cap on them. Nobody does that anymore. What they do is they say, now children, we're going to read a nice story and we're going to talk about what we think about this story. And when we discuss it, we're going to remember that we're very respectful of other people when they talk. And so by reminding people of the rules early and often, you may not need to actually go to the extreme point of actually shaming individual perpetrators. And so why do you want to avoid that shaming? It's because the research on shaming shows that typical reactions of individuals to being shamed in this literature on the emotional psychology of shame suggests that people become resentful. They may think that the shaming is unfair. They will very often hide the behavior that's being shamed rather than correct the behavior. It can lead to personality syndromes of despondency and alienation from the mainstream of society if they find that they're continually being shamed, especially in a way that leads them to conclude that they are somehow defective as human beings. Now, guilting suggests that the person has done a wrong action that you can make amends for, and then you're fine, you can be reintegrated into the group. But shaming that touches on something that's irremediable about the person's identity leads to alienation and sometimes the glorification of deviance, like juvenile delinquents that join motorcycle gangs or engage in other kinds of antisocial behavior. So shaming is even worse when it's directed at groups of people, because there's an obsession of groups with comparing one's own group, whether it's an ethnic group or a nation, to other groups, because people feel that if their own group is denigrated, that others will treat them as pariahs, will refuse to deal with them, will wonder whether they deserve to circulate in proper society, and will in fact wonder whether that group actually deserves to exist. So, so one problem in politics is that once you start shaming individuals and groups for behavior that deviates from some norm that you're imposing on them, this makes them available to be mobilized by illiberal elites that disagree with the liberal human rights norms that you're trying to force down their group's throat. And the traditional elites that have a very different view of what's normatively acceptable behavior will then call you, the human rights promoter, an imperialist who's trying to bully the group and undermine its true sense of group morality. So this is what happens when you shame people in general, and it's often what happens when there's human rights shaming going on, which is why there's so much backlash against shaming people over abortion, shaming people over LGBT differences, and it's been co-opted by illiberals, including manipulative illiberal dictators, the Putins and so forth of the world, who are having so much success pushing back against human rights shaming. It's a really deep both individual psychology and group psychology problem that the human rights movement has stumbled into, and it's I think one of the main mistakes that's playing into the hands of illiberal authoritarians and human rights abusers.
But is this shaming coming from primarily NGOs and activists, or is it a feature of the political debate discourse? I think my question is, how do you make that differentiation?
They don't like it when Joe Biden shames them, calls the Saudi prince a pariah, and they also don't like it when Human Rights Watch shames them. They don't like it even when Human Rights Watch documents it successfully, puts the shaming words in the mouths of people in their own society. In a way, it makes it even worse the more systematically you've proved the point that they deserve to be shamed. So my answer is yes to both.
Thank you. the question that touches upon a central feature of your book refers to looking at the state as the central political entity through which human rights and liberalism can be, I guess, enacted. But there is an important strand and a really powerful and compelling strand of human rights literature and understanding which claims that human rights can only be successful as a cosmopolitan project that goes beyond states and therefore functions on a certain global or transnational level. So since in your book you focus on states, how would you then answer these views, these cosmopolitanists' views?
Sam Moyne, a law professor, wrote one of the most impactful books on human rights a decade ago, where he made the argument that human rights had been invented in the late 1970s. And he said that the reason that human rights of the kind you're talking about, the transnational, global, international organization level of human rights work and global civil society became the site of, a lot of human rights activity at that time, he argued, was that the decolonized states had become despairing of achieving human rights in their own societies, which started off with a kind of civic hope that their own people in their own brand new nation state would achieve social justice and progress. But by the 1970s, so many of them lacked social justice, had taken authoritarian turns, and had not fulfilled the progressive hopes of the post-colonial nationalists in those societies. And so the global level of human rights, as captured by the creation of Human Rights Watch as a transnational human rights organization, was the new hope. But so there was some pushback on that from people who said, no, I thought human rights were invented in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But no, I think that's not right. I think the human rights revolution really happened in the 18th century with Thomas Jefferson and the French Revolution and the rights of man, and the basic ideas of civic rights, equality before the law were laid down at that time. And if you study the question of where have there been successes in instantiating rights in a real, powerful, meaningful way, it's been in countries that have created the institutional basis for liberal, rule of law democracy at the level of the nation state, because nation states are the entity that can successfully define what the rights are for their nation state, create an infrastructure of administration, a civil service that will actually follow the rules, and a legal system that citizens can bring their issues to and be adjudicated based on equality before the law. All that stuff happens in nation states. And the international foam that floats on top of nation states that talks about human rights and passes human rights laws and treaties, has no way to connect to reality unless it does so through the infrastructure of a nation state and its institutions. And so with the literature on human rights shows that the first most strong predictor of what countries actually have rights is whether their country is at peace or war, their country. And the second strongest correlate is whether the country is a democracy. And so those are state attributes and that determine whether countries have rights. And the comparative politics field has found that the strongest predictor of whether a state is a democracy and has rule of law and rights has to do with that state's internal attributes. However, I'll admit that after 1991, some studies have shown that the relative importance of the international system, things like, well, how many of the great powers in the system are liberal democracies and how many are authoritarians? They find that after about 1990, those international factors increase the likelihood of democracy and human rights in the system. So I don't want to say that the international level doesn't count for anything, but the basic anchor of rights, if it's really going to be meaningful in people's day-to-day lives and actually get results, pretty much has to be anchored on the kind of liberal democratic infrastructure. That's what our research finds.
So given that we are nearing the end of our discussion, I think we can finish with two big questions. And one of them focuses on the media, because you have a chapter in the book on the media. And you say that it should be assigned the highest priority among rights advocates. I would be curious to hear how you envision re-empowering journalists in this media system, and can journalists become gatekeepers again? Should they become gatekeepers, and can they become gatekeepers again? And how has recent changes, especially AI large language models, shifted that landscape?
So when the Founding Fathers came up with the First Amendment, they did not imagine a situation where Alex Jones could use his InfoWars platform to spread crazy conspiracy theories, hate speech, and defamation of completely innocent people instantly to an audience of 10 million people. That was not what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they wrote the First Amendment and saw freedom of speech as one of the pillars of democracy. The First Amendment also has in it freedom of the press. And my reading of the First Amendment and the whole context in which those ideas were being deliberated upon was not only that freedom of speech was a valuable right to an individual, but that freedom of speech if connected to a free press, was one of the key pillars of the democracy that the founders were trying to create. And it needs to be understood in that light. So the kind of freedom of speech that the hate speakers and defamers and the conspiracy theorists consider to be their personal right is, in my read, in conflict even with the First Amendment. So we have, in the United States of America, free speech absolutism, where Louis Brandeis made the argument that if there's a problem with free speech, the solution is always more speech, not some constraint on speech. And I agree with Brandeis up to a point. I think we should try never to censor the content of speech, except for certain categories like incitement to riot and defamation of character that are like well established in our common law. Instead of trying to make freedom of speech safe for democracy, and indeed a crucial support of democracy, by censoring problematic speech, we should always try to deal with problematic speech by structuring the format of discussion. So normally we have in the print media editors who exercise editorial discretion as to what kind of speech is newsworthy. We, on radio and television, there are interviews of people with all kinds of views, even views that push the boundaries of normal good judgment, but it's considered safe for democracy or even beneficial for democracy to hear disturbing opinions as long as they're presented in, say, an interview format where there's a knowledgeable, experienced, professional journalist who's been infused with the values of having a constructive conversation to provide the information that the people need. And where they can probe the statements, where they can have people debating their different views under the watchful eye and control of a journalist. So to have controversial people with huge audiences on social media could be perfectly fine if there's a responsible journalist sitting there managing that interaction. It's like Wikipedia. When it first started out, there were hardly any editors in charge of what got posted, and the results were a lot of false information and chaotic content on Wikipedia. But then once they actually hired some editors and had some rules for how volunteers could add information to Wikipedia, Wikipedia became a tremendous and very reliable source of information, as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica, some are saying. And so I think that professional journalists, professional editors can, really add a lot to our marketplace of ideas, even in the period where we have social media with large audiences. If there's some kind of different rule for how we handle speech speech on social media that reaches millions of people, the kind of commanding heights of the media system, as opposed to different ways that we handle problematic speech that are more idiosyncratic and are just reaching small audiences. So you asked about how AI fits into all of this. And I think that, we used to have a thing called the Fairness Doctrine that said that broadcasters, in order to have the privilege of occupying a space on the broadcast spectrum of TV and radio, had to meet certain minimum standards for providing thorough coverage of important public issues that would help citizens in a democracy understand those issues and enact their responsibilities as good citizens. And if your TV or radio station didn't do that, you could have your license revoked. And I think that companies that develop and market AI products could be put under the same sort of fairness doctrine standards, just as the social media platforms should be put under fairness doctrine standards. And this is not, government censorship or government, telling companies what people can say on their platform. This is just providing general guidelines that will create a kind of set of expectations which could have implications for regulation, self-regulation by in-house oversight bodies, or it could be relevant for lawsuit cases. So, we used to do this. And we had the Fairness Doctrine until 1988, when people decided that, oh no, there's so many sources of news and information that people can always find the truth if they want to, and there's no need to have any Fairness Doctrine. If you have one outlet that's biased, that won't matter, because there'll be 100 other outlets that will have the kind of news that's objective and constructive. Well, that turned out to be true but not true, and it's time to go back to the Fairness Doctrine for social media and AI and for talk radio and for Fox News.
Thank you. I would ask the last question. Yes, thank you for this exhaustive answer again. The last question that we, I guess, would like to ask is connected to the impending climate disaster. And in your book, you do not specifically engage with it in the sense that both the market economy and democracy seem to be almost incapable of resolving it, because when they come to these planetary absolutes, there seems to be a need of some kind of a enforced cooperation that curbs the current levels of consumption and lifestyle. So how would you then, when you look at human rights that obviously will be violated through climate disaster, how would you pragmatically address this? Or through the liberal system, how is there a possibility of escape?
Well, fixing the climate problem is a very hard problem, in part because it's going to cost a huge amount of money. It's going to involve reorienting very major sectors of the economy with implications for big capitalist businesses and many of their workers. And so it's a particularly hard problem. But I see rights approaches of the kind that I talk about in the Pragmatism book as, being highly relevant and useful to the solution to this problem in the same way that, rights approaches are useful to the solution of, many problems in society and have worked well in the past when they've been tried. So we've been talking about media, and so better regulation of information media and better regulation of the capitalist economy are part of it. We had climate change denial rampant, especially in the United States, for crucial decades when climate change was gathering steam, but not so obvious that, everybody understood that it was a problem like they do now. And if we had not had such an anarchical media system, if we had had the Fairness Doctrine where people were intensely exposed to discussion of the climate problem, that would have been a help, at least at the margins. If the regulatory hand of good government were stronger in the area of economic management, that would have helped limit climate change. Obama, tried to use executive orders and regulations based on executive power to get advances on the climate issue, but was blocked in part by the resistance on the part of particularly, capitalist businesses to regulation. All of this, of course, needs to happen through the context of representative government, and another tool of liberal rules-based social management through accountability to the people. But of course, representative government has to elect progressive, knowledge-based political forces in order to solve the problem. So how to do that? Strengthen social movements. So we had a civil rights movement that passed legislation in the United States in the 1960s because they had a powerful message, a strong political coalition behind them, and coordinated with a progressive party, the Democratic Party, that saw that it was in their interest to make a deal for the Civil Rights Act. Why can't we do that same formula for climate change? Where's the social movement? Greta Thunberg, puts on a good show, but where's the backup that is, willing and able to drive this home? And in terms of the international level of the climate problem, it's certainly true that there are a lot of squabbles over who will pay the bill for climate change adjustments, but it's, also true that, throughout the post-1945 period, there were always, selfish interests in trade, in the management of the financial and monetary system, where different states had different interests, and they horse traded over who would pay the bill, who would suffer the adjustment costs. And so I see no reason why those tools of liberalism embedded in powerful states that form powerful international organizations can't deal with this problem. I don't think there's anything wrong with those basic tools of liberalism. It's just that they're not being used because there hasn't been smart and effective political motivation of constituencies that stand to benefit from this.
So with that somewhat hopeful note, we would like to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and especially thank you for writing the book. We would definitely recommend that people read it, and we're pretty certain that it will continue to spur interesting conversations going forward. So thank you, Professor Snyder.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to get these opinions off my chest. I appreciate it.
Thank you.